King, comfort of the Spirit, truth, giver, president, full us all things, treasure, blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good. So, are there any questions or anything anybody wants to?
The blue moon, no.
Wolf, super
Blood. Moon. It's from the Revelation.
Is it?
Yeah, this one. Oh, not that.
Yeah.
It says about it.
Yeah. Anyway, what I want to do for the next few sessions is we'll go through parts of the book of Revelation. I'm not going to do the whole thing because I can't do it justice. And look at some of the themes. But I think it's really important to know some of the material involved. Are there any more Bibles, by the way, with Old Testament?
Should we start bringing your Bibles?
Yeah.
Follow?
That's New Testament.
Yeah.
While we're looking for that, I do have a question. If it's too lengthy, then you don't have to. But how much of what is written about refers to events occurring at that time, as opposed to what is to come?
It's all about that time. The whole thing is about that time, as well as about what's to come. So it's both. It's an explanation of the history as well as eschatology. So it doesn't look like there's, yeah.
Is it sort of like how the Old Testament has types
Yes.
that prefigure Christ?
Yeah. There's so much of this is based in a typological understanding. Now, I was reading through some of the patristic commentaries on the book of Revelation, and it's all allegorical commentary. It has very little to do with the text itself, and much less any kind of explanation of what the text is dealing with at the time, and some of it, but mostly it's an allegory of about spiritual life, all the various commentaries. So that's not particularly useful. So don't worry about it. We'll cope.
Okay, it's Revelation 6. Revelation 6, 12, 14.
Oh, okay. Okay, so to start with the beginning of the book, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus, of Jesus Christ, to all things that he saw. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. So what's really important is that this is a revelation. This is a prophetic vision. These are prophetic visions, which were shown to Jesus. For Jesus to then show to his servants, and he did so by imparting them to St. John, who was the beloved disciple, who was the closest of his disciples. Now, the scholars sometimes think that this was the last of the books of the Bible to be written. But actually, if you look and analyze the text a little bit, that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, it could have been one of the first of the books of the New Testament to be written. And we'll go into that a little bit later as to why. But the dating is fairly important because of what the nature of the controversies are that were being dealt with in the text. And one of the controversies that underlies especially the first part of the book of Revelation is the disagreement, in fact the bitter disagreement between the party of John, or the party of James, as it's called elsewhere, and the party of Paul. And there are two very different perspectives. Well, who was John? Okay, who was the Apostle John? He was the beloved disciple. He was a very young man when he was a disciple of Jesus. He was in his teens. He was from the household of the high priest. Maybe he was a son of the high priest, but he was within that lineage. He knew, in other words, he knew the entire inner workings of the temple and of the high priesthood, and who to go to get into places. For example, remember, John was able to bring Peter in when Jesus was being tried, and they didn't question him at all, but he knew the servant girl, and that was that, so into a proceeding which otherwise would have been closed. Later on, the church history books tell us that, in other words, Josephus and some of the other contemporary authors tell us that John was known to be a high priest, a Jewish high priest, and that he would wear the high priestly vestments, including the pedilon, which was a plate, a jeweled plate, with 12 stones signifying the 12 tribes of Israel. It was, in other words, it was the Jewish equivalent of the Panagia. And high priest is higher, and hierarch are the same concept. So John was obviously, as the beloved disciple, he was one of the three closest to Jesus. Remember that with the apostles there were various kinds of circles around Jesus. Jesus had a special relationship with Peter. He had a special relationship with John. And then there was Peter, James, and John. That James was the brother of John. Later on, James, the brother of Jesus, in other words, his stepbrother, was pulled into that kind of very tight circle of leadership. Then there were there were John and Peter, and then there were the 3, and then there were the 12, and then there were the 70, and then there were the 120. And if you listen to the Synaxarians' readings, which is it's a wonderful thing to have, the readings of the lives of the saints that are prescribed for every day, especially in monasteries. You know, it'll talk about the disciples, you know, these saints being one of the 12, or one of the 70, or one of the 120. And all of these had unique personal relationships with Jesus. Well, St. John in particular, you know, where Peter was probably quite a bit older than Jesus, or a bit older than Jesus, John was probably much younger, so he would have been like a younger brother to him. You know, probably 15 years difference. But there was probably some kind of blood, kind of connection of being a relative. I hesitate to say a blood connection, but it probably was, if you want to consider it that way. Because Mary also came from a priestly lineage, right? And she was raised in the temple, and so there was this connection. Even though the temple itself, even though the priesthood was corrupt, and even though it wasn't what it had been in the first temple, still it was a holy place. Still, the sacrifices went on. Still, the priestly ministrations went on. But there remained this memory, even while they had the second temple, of the first temple, which had been destroyed around 586 BC. So here it is, 600 years later, and the second temple is a mess. Anyway.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question? Then you have, they talk about 7 churches or 7 temples.
Right, we'll get there. We'll get there. Okay. So John was one of the closest of the disciples, and it was because John probably had some kind of was probably a relative of some kind, a cousin or something of Jesus, and because of his relationship, Jesus entrusted Mary, his mother, to John when Jesus was dying on the cross. Now, one of the things that was very it was incredibly difficult at the time was for a woman to be left as a widow and not have any children, because women were most women were basically lived kind of sequestered lives, and they were supported entirely by their husbands. They didn't work. They didn't work outside the home. They did things inside the home. They would keep the house. They would do all the cooking and the cleaning and all of that, and spin yarn and make cloth. Remember, they had no commercial or commercialization of making even thread or making cloth. So much of it was done at home, and so every spare moment, women would be spinning thread, because it takes a lot of thread to make a garment, right? And we know from the various histories that Mary had been one of the girls who had been chosen to spin thread for a new curtain for the temple, the new veil of the temple. And that's why in the icon she's often pictured of the icon of the Annunciation. She's often pictured holding a spindle and a what do you call it? well, of thread. And so, so it would have, you know, even dying on the cross, Jesus, you know, took care of his mother and assigned her to John. Well, she lived another 15 years after Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. And for the most part, she lived with John in Jerusalem, and then eventually in Ephesus. Ephesus was was the major capital, as it were, of Eastern Asia Minor. And eventually it became the ecclesiastical capital. But it was a huge city, it was a huge port, and there's all sorts of ruins there of the old city. The harbor silted up, so it's now inland, but it used to be right on the coast. And one of the things that's there is Mary's house, that you can still go and see. The Catholics have a great veneration for that house. The Orthodox aren't too sure about it, but the Catholics, they really like, they go there, and that's a big deal. Now, at the time, there was also, if you'll remember, from the book of Acts, a controversy going on between those who were of the party of James and who insisted that when people would convert to Christianity, when men would convert, they would have to be circumcised and would have to essentially become Jews. They would have to take on the law. It's interesting that in the book of Acts, that it says that this line was being pushed by Pharisees who had converted to Christ, who believed in Christ, which makes a lot of sense. If you remember, at the time of Jesus, there were three major sects, or four major sects within Judaism. There were the Pharisees, there were the Sadducees, there were the Essenes, and there were the Zealots. And all of these are testified to by Josephus and some of the other contemporary writers. And it's kind of interesting that the Pharisees get about 2 or 3 paragraphs, the Sadducees get about 1 paragraph, and the Essenes get 7 pages in Josephus. So obviously he had more of a kind of Essene association. And then there were the Zealots. And the Zealots were those who were very steadfastly opposed to the Roman occupation of Palestine. And they wanted to wage war to get rid of the Romans and reestablish the Jewish kingdom. Now, the Jewish kingdom, in reality, disappeared in 586 BC with the exile of the elites to Babylon. What came back, the exiles that came back, they never reestablished the Davidic king. They rebuilt the temple, but they never were able to establish kingship again because they were always a vassal state. And so the kind of kingship that existed in Judaism, as opposed to the Hebrew kingdom of David and Solomon, all the way through Josiah and Hezekiah, was very different than the original model that was that prevailed when David and Solomon were kings. And it was at this time that that those elites who came back from Babylon brought back a whole new version of their religion, which was actually Judaism. Judaism didn't exist before the exile. There was Hebrew religion, but Judaism as we know it, with rabbis, and synagogues, and the Old Testament, the Torah, and certain of the feast days and things like that, was totally renewed, and it also had a very different theology than the Judaism of the first temple. We'll get into that later.
And the language was different.
And the language was different, yeah. Before the exile, people spoke Hebrew. After the exile, they spoke Aramaic.
Is that where around like the Talmud started to begin?
It started in Babylon.
Babylon.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Because in the religion of the first temple was not a scriptural religion. It wasn't, it wasn't about the study of scriptures. There were some writings, but there were some of the writings of the prophets, but there was nothing that would, where people would go to listen to the scriptures and study them and all of that kind of thing. There were priests, not rabbis. There's a huge difference between a priest, who is somebody who offers sacrifice, and a rabbi, who's basically just a scholar. A priest is somebody who's consecrated, and especially the high priest was somebody who was consecrated with the anointing oil. It was this with the chrism. It was the same consecration as the consecration of the king. And in fact, during First Temple Judaism, the king was the priest. And it was the king who offered sacrifice, especially on the major days. And what we have as the scriptures, because the scriptures were written by the party of the Reform that happened in 586, that happened in 600 BC, there were shortly before before it all collapsed. You have the scriptures were written by the Reformers, and not by the people of or not by the clergy or whatever of the First Temple. Yeah.
Sorry to derail this from Revelation, because we're kind of going on an Old Testament path, but
this is all important background.
Okay, the kingship. You mentioned they were the high priests. Did this also happen when because you read a lot in the Old Testament where there's like kind of like evil kings, like the ones that weren't really like doing God's will. They were kind of like leading the nation astray. Were those also still high priests, or were they were they still doing the sacrifices even though they were?
As long as they were Davidic kings, all the king in Kings and Chronicles, those were all, because it basically, I think Chronicles basically ends with the exile, right? So, yeah, it was, and there's just how evil those kings were is another question that's considered by scholars and is quite interesting.
Yeah, I was hesitant to say the word evil because I couldn't think of it.
Well, it's what the text says.
Yeah, exactly.
Because remember, this is that those labels were put on there by the Reformers, who opposed the party of the First Temple.
Oh.
So it would have been like a bunch of Calvinists writing about the Catholics.
Wow.
And theologically, it would have been more like Jehovah's Witnesses writing about the Orthodox. And actually, it was a very similar kind of transition, because the whole idea of God was different in the First Temple than after the reforms of Josiah and Hezekiah, after which God let the temple be destroyed. So I kind of think he wasn't too happy. Yeah.
So what does this imply? Because you're kind of implying with this that the Old Testament was written by reformers. What does this imply for us reading it? Should we take it with a grain of salt?
No, it's a complex document that needs to be understood as a complex document with a history and with things that can be understood on multiple levels.
Okay.
But we're not fundamentalists. We don't take it at face value. And that's really important. And it has, well, I'll talk a little bit about that. So in the First Temple, you have this, you had this kind of, well, you had the king who was also the high priest, and it was the king who would as the high priest of the people would enter into the Holy of Holies and offer sacrifice. But when he did, one of the vestments that he would wear was a crown with the name of God on it, Yahweh. And it was understood that in the First Temple, that the king, high priest, or the priest king, when he went into the Holy of Holies, especially when he was anointed at first as the king, he came forth as Yahweh. He became Yahweh. In other words, he was the sacrament of God with his people, Emmanuel. In other words, he was deified, and so the kingship was sacramental. Not only was he a priest who would offer sacrifice, but he was but as king he was the sacrament of God's kingship of the people. And this is very important in understanding kingship and understanding priesthood, because that role in the Second Temple, because there were no kings of that level, was taken over by the high priest. So that in the Second Temple, the high priest coming out of the Holy of Holies was understood as the presence of God in the midst of the people, and was treated as such. There's one of the Psalms talks about, and they worship the priest and king, or no, they worship the God and King. Now, it's not that they worship God and the King, but it's referring to one person, the God King. And what this was part of was a an earlier understanding in the religion of the patriarchs that God was multi-personal. Now, that's, to use that kind of theological language reflects something from the 4th century Christianity. But essentially, it wasn't three gods, but God was a henosis, was a henotic concept of God. In other words, it was God was a unity with diversity within it. There was diversity within the Godhead. So there was the God Almighty, there was His Son Yahweh, and then there was His Mother, the Holy Spirit. And in Hebrew, it would have been Mother, also referred to as wisdom. So in the first temple, you had this virtual. It wasn't exactly an idea of a Trinity, but it approached that. And if you look at if you really pull apart the teaching of Jesus, that's exactly what He's teaching. And it's a return to the religion of the patriarchs, to the faith of the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, and the prophets. Over against the reforms of Josiah. Now, Josiah's reform was a radical theological reform and a radical liturgical reform. It says that Josiah was the king around 600 BC. He went in, he found the temple to be in shambles, and so they dug out some old manuscripts that were stuffed in a corner someplace, and proclaimed them to the people, and he instituted a great Passover. Well, what's interesting is that represented a radical change in how the people celebrated the feasts, and a radical change in how they understood God, because what Josiah was preaching was the idea that God is a solitary monad. He's not a henosis, not a union of multiple persons in one being, which is the Christian idea. Christianity, the Trinity is a henotic concept of God. But it's rather a monad. It means one solitary thing. And it's the God of the philosophers, basically. And that's, you read Socrates, you read Aristotle, that's their concept of God. It's very possible, actually, that there was contact between the early Greek philosophers and the Jews. And in fact, some of the Greek philosophers write about it. So it's rather than Judaism being Hellenized, it was rather Hellenic philosophy being Judaized. It didn't flow this way; it flowed that way. Just like Hebrew, it flows that way, not this way. So there were all sorts of radical reforms, and one of the things that Josiah did, and you can read all about it, the Old Testament, is that he cleansed the temple of everything that was contrary to his concept of God. And so all of the images that were connected with the cult of wisdom, the divine spirit, the feminine principle of the divinity, or the feminine person of the divinity, were removed. What were they? They were trees, Asherah. So if you go to look at Israeli antiquities, you see all these real antiquities, like these female figures. Well, that's what those were, and they used images. They used and so you know, in a sense, Josiah was this kind of radical Puritan who purged the temple of the images that were in it now, and said that this was something evil. Well, in his system, it was evil. In the system of the religion of the patriarchs, this was the tradition. So it was just like the Protestant Reformation in many ways. You know, the Protestants went in, and they destroyed the statues. They whitewashed the frescoes, and they got rid of all of the references, you know, especially all the visual references and the images of the saints, and especially of the Virgin Mother. And you want a shaking experience, go to liturgy here on Sunday morning, then go to a Bach consortium at the Presbyterian church just up on Nebraska, which is a totally iconoclast structure. It's got interesting architecture, but there are no images.
It's beautiful from outside, right?
Oh, it's nice outside. It's a nice building, but there's there's certainly not a crucifix in there. I think there's vaguely a cross. Yeah, but it's iconoclast, and so Josiah's reform was iconoclast.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
It's interesting because there must have been, I speculate, echoes or reflections among the popular, among the people of that period, because they've found synagogues that do actually have images.
Right. Jesus' time,
must have, even from his time.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they're covered with frescoes.
That somehow that attachment must have survived, and it was allowed amongst maybe some people. There was that attachment to they weren't able to get rid of it entirely.
Well, the thing is, the temple was full of images.
Yeah,
and the Holy of Holies was full of images.
Even the second temple.
A second temple, I don't know about. The first one was full of images. It had cherubim everywhere. It had cherubim, and then it had palm trees. They were carved into the walls and into all the decorations and the doors and everything else. And there were the cherubs on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And then there were two huge 10 cubits high. That's what, 15 feet?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 15 feet. Two huge cherubim dominating the Holy of Holies, with the ark in between them. And the ark this was the first temple, and the ark was either the throne or the footstool of the king. Now, references to the throne in certain places of the Old Testament have been edited out by the Jews, and so it's very important to the scholarship is very important, yeah, because what it shows is that the Old Testament has a history. You know, it's not the Quran, it's not the Book of Mormon, either dropped from heaven or found on golden plates and translated by looking, you know, a guy looking at two rocks in his hat, you know, some eternal testament, you know. The Old Testament is a book with lots and lots and lots and lots of history, and that's undergone all sorts of violence over the course of the centuries. And the text has gone up, and that's why in the book of Revelation, for example, there's a warning that nobody should mess with the text of this book. Because when it was being written, what was going on? People were messing with the text of the Old Testament. The Jews were rewriting the Old Testament. Yeah.
Well, I have so many questions now after that.
Yeah, this is.
I'll start with one that just popped up during that little part between when I raised my hand and when I put it down. Is that also in the Septuagint, or is that just in the Masoretic text that the Hebrews or the Jews edited it out? Is it Septuagint?
The Masoretic text in particular.
Okay.
The Septuagint reflects a much older reading of the Hebrew Scriptures.
And then another question that I wanted to know is this means that we almost have to, by my understanding of what you're saying, we almost have to read the Old Testament not necessarily opposite to the way that Protestants do, but kind of like opposite.
We can't read it like Protestants do.
Oh, absolutely not. But like it's almost like completely on the other side, because you're reading it from the side knowing that this is like, you know, this is pretty much like the Jewish perspective of things that was very, you know, almost like geared against Christianity, because they're like writing from the source of like...
That's exactly what it was. It was geared against Christianity. It was edited to edit out things that would support Christian arguments.
So the whole sola scriptura then is
all nonsense.
Inevitably going to Judaize the church to the point where you don't even have Christianity anymore.
Well, isn't that what's happened?
Yeah, well, yeah, it has. But
it has, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Wow.
But in the Hebrew religion, there was no images were not prohibited like in Islam. I mean,
no.
They had images.
No, there were images.
There were images.
And but then then there were also, you know, because the people were living in a pagan world, then there was corruption of the religion wasn't exactly pure, and so people would have, pagan idols as well as the images of So there were all sorts of problems with that, and that's
why he went to the extreme, in a way.
Well, Now I have trouble imagining that the Davidic kings would have introduced pagan images into the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It seems like maybe still there's echoes of the old religion coming through, like in the messianic sort of psalms where you see God appointing his king in Zion and saying, you are my son today, I have begotten you, Psalm 2. So
yeah, that's particularly important psalm for this.
Okay.
And what is it? It's an enthronement psalm. And on one hand, it's messianic, in the sense of eschatological, but on the other sense, it's a description of what happened to the royal prince when he was consecrated. Just like, what did we just hear on Sunday? Mm-hmm. You are my beloved son. Mm-hmm. This day I have, and there are actually some texts that of the New Testament that read, "This day I have begotten you." Not "in whom I am well pleased," but "this day I have begotten you," which is the quote from the Old Testament. Mm. And so it's important to. One of the things that I have discovered much too late in my religious career, if you want to use it that, is that it's really important to read this very, very, very carefully. And to read and know the Old Testament very thoroughly, and not just superficially. And to really know the text, and not just know Bible stories. You know, Bible stories are nice, they're cute, but it misses 2/3, 4/5, or 9/10 sometimes of what the text actually is saying. So, because it's the text itself, and in some places, and with the Hebrew in particular, with a traditional Hebrew text, it would even be the placement of the letters on the page. Because there are acrostics, and there's acrostics going that way, and there's acrostics going that way, and that's part of how they made sure that the text was
Not altered.
that there weren't any major mistakes in the text. That through the placing of these acrostics, you know, you were sure that you could go to a particular place in the text, and in every scroll it would be identical. Otherwise, the letters wouldn't be in the same place. And if you missed a letter, it would throw everything off. Well, missing a letter in Hebrew is much more serious than missing a letter in English, because Hebrew doesn't write vowels, and you had to, and they didn't use pointing at that stage of the development of Hebrew, so you simply had to know which vowels went in the text, and three consonants can be combined all sorts of different ways with different vowels. And so the big thing in Hebrew is wordplay. Because a word can mean one thing, or it can mean something entirely different. And that change of meaning can be radical. So one of the examples of that, he was marred beyond human semblance, right? In Isaiah 51. Marred. You can and so what does that bring to mind? You know, the flogging, you know, and the beating, and you know, when Jesus was crucified. However, that same word with different consonants reads, he was anointed.
Different vowels.
Beyond human semblance. Which means he was transfigured. So, that's a rather different understanding. And you could see why, in an anti-Christian context, they would not want to say he was anointed beyond human semblance, but rather he was marred beyond human semblance. Because the whole point was, that Jesus was a shame. It was a shameful.
He was rejected.
Yeah. So, where are we going with this?
Far away.
So First Temple religion, and the transition to the Second Temple. Now there was this 70-year gap in Babylon, where the scriptures were composed, where rabbinic Judaism was formed, and was then brought back to Palestine with an expense account from the king of Babylon to rebuild the buildings and things like that, and rebuild the temple, but no king. And so they brought this new religion back which was in sharp contrast to the old religion. And so there were different strata of society. So it was the elites, the priestly class, some of the priestly class, and some of whom became the Sadducees. And then the rabbinic class from Babylon became the Pharisees, were the Pharisees. But then there were all these other people who held to the old tradition, the Hebrews. Did you ever question why the book of Hebrews was written to the Hebrews and not to the Jews? Because there's a whole lot of difference between Hebrews and Jews. Because Jews, in Old Testament context, is a religion. It's a religion that came out of the exile, characterized by the study of the Torah and then you have the Talmud and all of this rabbinic tradition, which was the primary realm of the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees also preserved elements of the older tradition. They believed in spirits, they believed in angels, they believed in demons, they believed in souls, they believed in an afterlife, and they believed in the judgment. Whereas the Sadducees, who were the priests, or the kind of leading people around the temple, I don't think not all the high priests, obviously, but the kind of party that controlled the temple. They didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in spirits, they didn't believe in souls, they didn't believe in an afterlife, and they didn't believe in the judgment. So when you're dead, and that's it. And the only thing that lasts is your progeny.
So atheist.
Yeah, it's almost atheist.
Yeah, why even practice any religion at that point?
Well,
It was a religion.
so why do you think Jesus would upbraid them like he did? As hypocrites. Then you have the Essenes. And they held even more to the old religion, but they also rejected the Second Temple. It's not about the building. It's about the priesthood. It's about the whole complex. And evidently, according to the history, as the first century progressed, after Jesus, there were a whole bunch of the high priesthood became something that was for sale, and it was just it was extremely corrupt. Not entirely. There were still holy people, and in fact, James, the brother of the Lord, was not only the Bishop of Jerusalem, but in other words, he was the high priest for the Christians, but he was evidently regarded as a high priest, and he wouldn't have been vested in in the high priest's vestments unless he was a high priest, because you can't play in that kind of society. You can't play act. You can't go off and buy a set of vestments and walk down Fifth Avenue, in Byzantine drag, or you can't. Well, here you can, but there you couldn't. The Essenes also had these monastic communities, like the one at Qumran, where they preserved, which were the centers where this tradition was preserved. And so my guess is that these were kind of alternate places where people would go, since they would not go to the temple, and they were probably forbidden from going to the temple.
Were they the scribes too?
Scribes would have been with Sadducees.
Mm.
It was that whole complex of people around the temple.
And there are monasteries, scribes.
Yep.
Were there?
Yeah, no, that's later. That's later. With the in the Judaism of the time, the scribes and the lawyers were Sadducees, and then there were the Pharisees. There were probably scribes who were Pharisees too, but what separated them was a very different faith, very different belief. And then the Essenes, was a totally different system. It was the first temple system, and they saw the second temple priesthood as something entirely corrupt. And one of the reasons that it was seen as something entirely corrupt was that all of the records of the genealogies of who belonged to which tribe, in other words, the tribe of Levi and the line of Aaron, had been burned when the temple was destroyed. And so nobody could prove that they actually were qualified to be a high priest. Because it was hereditary. So there were the Levites, and there were the sons of Aaron, and the sons of Aaron were kind of like a royal lineage, as it were, a royal priesthood, without being kings. Now all these themes, it should be pretty plain, come together as we start to look at the person of Jesus, right? Jesus, who was priest and king, Jesus the great high priest, Jesus the son of David, the king of Israel. How was he received on Palm Sunday? Hosanna to the son of David, the king. And the whole idea was that he was coming back to restore the Davidic kingship that had been lost at the time of the exile. Another aspect was that all of the contents of the Holy of Holies disappeared at or before the time of the exile. So there was no Ark of the Covenant, there was no menorah, there was no table of the showbread. There was they had 7 branch candlesticks, big ones, but those weren't necessarily those, like the one that was there's a picture of it on the Roman triumphal arch that depicts the sack of Jerusalem. A very Jewish-looking menorah, right? But that's not necessarily the menorah that was in the Holy of Holies. The menorah in the Holy of Holies was a golden, an almond tree that was made out of gold, with candles or lamps. And it's interesting, on Mount Athos, you go to some of the monasteries, and they have these things. Not the ones from the Jewish temple, but they have these trees that are made out of gold that are lampstands. But the one in the temple, the main one in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, was actually connected with the cult of wisdom, the Divine Mother. A tree, So, so also, for example, the the importance that we place that Christ was crucified on a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily a standing tree, but on wood. Yeah.
I just kind of put two and two together, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but is that why during the Protestant Reformation they took out the Book of the Wisdom of Solomon, because he spoke of wisdom as, a woman?
Probably. I think more because it was it spoke of wisdom as semi-divine or as divine.
Yeah.
And there wasn't any room because the Reformation, I mean, their theology was really out to lunch. But with the theological reformation of Josiah, it was like going from Russian Orthodox to Jehovah's Witness.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine what a radical thing it was. So with this foundation, it's important. It's very useful to understand what a radical book Revelation is, and how radical Christianity was in relationship to Judaism, because it was contradicting the fundamental aspects of the Reformation of Josiah. And Jesus's preaching, he's very plain about it. He said to the Jews, especially in the Gospel of John, "You do not know God. You don't know God. You've missed God." And that's radical. Not to mention it talks about angels and spirits and saints and and the afterlife and resurrection and all of these things, which to the Sadducee group were anathema. But yet we're very much a part of both the Essene, because this is basically a return to the vision of the first temple, as well as to the to some degree to the Pharisees. A lot of this would have been very familiar to the Pharisees, and there's a whole genre of literature of which this is a part, but this is the Christian version of apocalyptic literature that was floating around in the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD in Judaism and in Christianity, and indeed while Judaism and Christianity remained one thing. Yeah.
I wanted to know one other thing about the whole Reformation. There's a lot of I'm thinking specifically of the parable of what is it called? The Good Samaritan, where it was a non-Jew who was more virtuous than a Jew, and that was completely anathema to the Jewish people. Is that something that would be more likened to the first temple, where it wasn't there wasn't an ethnic supremacy kind of ideal?
Well, that's complicated. With the Jews, there was a radical ethnic supremacy. Samaritans were not only regarded as heretics, but they were also regarded as pagans. So, even by this time in the Talmud, their basic attitude towards non-Jews is that they have no souls and they're therefore just animals. So.
With the Samaritans, how did they, they have different religious practices than the Jews. Are they somehow more, they're from the northern kingdom, right? Are they somehow more connected with the first temple? I was just curious about that.
No, the Samaritans were, they were part of the people that were left behind at the, when the elites of Judah were taken off by the Babylonians, and indeed they were the people that were left behind when the Assyrians carted off the northern kingdom, the elites of the northern kingdoms, but then they intermarried with the pagans, and so there was a kind of a fusion, which is why the Jews viewed them as unclean.
So the four groups you're speaking of, the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, and the other one, was there one particular group that gravitated or embraced Christianity more than the others?
Probably the Essenes.
Yeah.
And then followed by the Pharisees.
Then probably the Pharisees, and the rivalry between the two of them is one of the things that you find as an undercurrent in the Book of Revelation, and as the dominant theme in the Book of Acts.
Your comment a moment ago about certain aspects being familiar to the Pharisees, that would go toward a hermeneutic that would argue that First and Second Temple, it was syncretic as opposed to
No.
complete.
No. No, it was a different religion. It was the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it was the one God, but a multi-personal deity,
Right.
a henotic idea of God, as opposed to the monadic concept of after the reforms of Josiah.
But there were continuities.
There was liturgical continuity,
The
but not
Pharisees also
totally.
accepted that the patriarchs were real,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
that the Sabbath should be sanctified,
Oh yeah.
and creation of the world. So there were certain very important aspects.
Right. One of the things the scholars talk about, and I would like to investigate this more because it makes a lot of sense, is that the whole tradition of Moses and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and especially Deuteronomy were introduced during the exile. And that the rewriting of the scriptures was a writing of Moses into the tradition. Now, but it's interesting, if you look at the preaching of Jesus, he makes a very great distinction between and the apostles. There's a great distinction between the patriarchs and the law of Moses. So, for example, the law of Moses is superseded, right? In Christ. The law of Moses ends with Jesus, and there's a new covenant.
He's the fulfillment.
And well, he's the fulfillment, but it's his. And remember, Jesus was accused of preaching against the law of Moses, right? I mean,
Then he said,
throughout the New Testament, his accusers are saying he's not upholding Moses. He's not teaching the law of Moses.
but he also said to be obedient to the law.
But
of Moses.
yes,
And I think some of the dispute was over because everything wasn't in the scripture or even
right.
passed down. For example, not to work on the Sabbath. Well, what constitutes work? where do you draw the line?
Mm-hmm.
So there were those kinds of issues.
Yeah. Well, what the scholars talk about is that there are elements from the much older tradition before Moses, from the patriarchs. Because remember, the patriarchs were hundreds of years before Moses. That there were elements in that religion, including the Ten Commandments, including a law. So, for example, in Ezekiel, it has this whole long discussion of the new temple, right? Ezekiel's vision of the new temple towards the end of the book. He doesn't mention high priests and Levites. Okay? He talks about the prince offering sacrifice.
The what?
The prince, the king. That's mind-blowing. Okay? You look at the narratives about David and Solomon. There's no mention of Levites. There's no mention of the Aaronic priesthood.
Who is the patriarch in the Old Testament?
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
That's all. It's not a profession.
No. It refers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the fathers of the nation. So there's evidence in the text itself for that there was a radical change, and there was a radical change. And remember where Jesus says that there's a change in the law when there's a change in the priesthood, or if there's going to be a change in the priesthood, there's going to be a change in the law. I think it's in Hebrews. And that's a pretty interesting comment there. And it would have a context that would get people thinking about all, what does this mean in my context now? So.
Doesn't it also talk about in Hebrews that Jesus was a priest of the order of Melchizedek,
right,
who was he was a king and a priest.
Right.
He was the king of Salem, I think.
Melchizedek, yeah.
Yeah. And he meets Abraham and
right.
offers, and Abraham offers him I forget how it goes.
And he has Melchizedek offer a sacrifice on his behalf. And Abraham gives him a tithe as an offering. So in a sense, Melchizedek was a priest for Abraham. But this is long before kingship, right? Mm-hmm. This is 1,000 years before kingship. So, according to the scholars, if you look at the Old Testament text, Melchizedek is only mentioned a couple of times, very minor. There's the meeting with Abraham. He's mentioned in the Psalms, and then, of course, then in the New Testament, rather more extensively. But there was a whole. Remember, the Bible comes out of a context of literature, and not all of, a lot of that literature did not make it into the Bible, nor necessarily should it have. But it was not. It was extra biblical literature, but stuff that the people would read. So there was the Enoch tradition, for example. There were all of these other books. If you look at the Book of Kings and of Chronicles, it lists books that have been lost for millennia. And so here again, you know, the Bible has a context. Well, there was a whole history of who Melchizedek was and what his role was, and he became a prophetic type of the Messiah, as well as a priest and king, the type of the priest and the king, and so he also becomes the type of Christ. And that's how he's used in the New Testament as this type from the Old Testament of royal kingship. There's some question as to whether Melchizedek is a name or a title. I forget what Melch
is king.
He's a king.
Yeah.
Zadok is a righteous person, righteous man.
Yeah.
He's like righteous king.
Righteous king, yeah. And
Melech is king.
okay. It's interesting
Zadok is
that
righteous, but Tzedakah would be also justice and charity.
Mhm.
So that all that would be part of the word.
Mm-hmm. There's another cognate for Zadok or Sadducee.
It
Sadducea.
could be
Yeah,
the roots of the.
right. So the Anglicization distorts it. So does this make sense?
Yeah. I'd be interested to know what it was with the Essenes. Maybe we could do this next time, but what it was that gravitated, you know, with the Essenes that probably caused them to become Christians. So.
Yeah, my guess is that.
Book of Hebrews.
What's that?
Wasn't the Book of Hebrews to set that in motion?
Maybe partly, but I think they recognized that their tradition was fulfilled in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That Jesus was preaching the tradition that they were trying to maintain.
So could it be said that they were the true Jews?
No,
Okay.
they were true Hebrews, but they weren't true Jews.
Okay, that's all right.
So, I don't know. There were large classes of people that were forbidden from going to the temple,
Oh.
the second temple, and I wonder if the Essenes were part of that.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
If you wanted to learn more about the Essenes, where would you look?
it's hard to find. There's also a kind of New Agey attempts to, you know, and all sorts of nonsense written about them. So sorting through all of that stuff is tough.
Earlier you mentioned that the Hellenes were being Judaized rather than the reverse. And understanding that the Essenes was trying to cut out that Hellenization, and the whole period of the Old Testament being rewritten and taken out. Wasn't that more geared at trying to take out the Hellene philosophies?
No, it wasn't so much that it wasn't so much that there was Hellenism in Judaism. Is that a lot of the Judaism went into Hellenism.
Mm-hmm.
That what's his name? The mathematician.
Pythagoras?
Pythagoras. Pythagoras went and spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. And so he brought, and spent time with the wise men of the temple. Pythagoras, he was the great mathematician, but he was also a philosopher. And so what he brought back to Athens, he was also kind of the root of a lot of later philosophy.
It kind of seems to fly in the face of everything else I've heard. Just with
It does.
the idea that the Jews were trying to purify their religion, especially at the time of Christ, from the broader Roman context.
Well, this is 400, 500 years before that. And Judaism never did purify its religion from. In fact, Judaism became, and some of the greatest figures of Judaism actually were very Hellenized, and more Hellenized. So, yeah.
Do you think this geared philosophers away from Christianity later on?
No.
No?
No, because most of those, well, a lot of the, well, I don't know actually. You know, I don't know philosophy in the middle, or those, like the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 4th century of the Roman Empire. You know, I know Plotinus was extremely important, and there were, you know, there were, you know, and he's going, of course, back to Socrates and Aristotle. He goes back to Pythagoras. But philosophy is not my strong suit. So it would be really interesting to study. Yeah.
I'm thinking back to when I was a Protestant, and basically we would, you know, read these summaries of the different books, and there would always be this debate about when was this book penned, right? And it was always said, well, there are these modern scholars who say, well, no, this book wasn't written back in the time of Moses, but it was written in the time of the exile, or much later, in Daniel and things. And then there were the, you know, the really staunch Protestants who say, no, it was written back then. But this would really tie into what you're saying, because it would seem to suggest that, you know, probably those scholars know a lot more than they were giving credence for, that a lot of those books, their dating is probably incorrect, because they were probably written a lot later.
Well, some were, yeah. Some were. And then, you know, for example, a lot of the Hebrew scriptures, you know, the kind of main manuscripts for the Hebrew scriptures were burned, you know, when they burned the first temple. Yeah. And so they had to be reconstructed. Well, there's the book of 4th Esdras talks about that. Now, the book of 4th Esdras, it's debatable whether, and the book of Ezra talks about that, Ezra, because Ezra was the guy in charge of building the second temple. Now, after the second temple was destroyed and burned, all of the kind of authoritative manuscripts were burned, and so they had to be reconstructed. And so in 4th Esdras, which is in the Orthodox canon of the Old Testament, but it's written as if it was in referring to the first Ezra in 400 BC, as opposed to Esdras in 100 AD, that he and a team of others reconstructed the scriptures. And when they did so, they reconstructed they wrote about 100 books. Now, 30 of those books, or 50, or I don't remember how many are in the Old Testament. What is it? You're a Protestant. How many books are there in the Old Testament?
I don't know.
No.
I don't think it's 50. Though.
Yeah,
No, it's 37, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
it's
37.
the song they taught you
There's a
in Bible school.
mathematical
Yeah, I think it's
formula to
I
that.
think it's 37.
I think it's 37, yeah.
But what about the other 63? Those books were intended, and it says in the text that those books were intended only for people of proven wisdom. In other words, they were not for general consumption. They were not to be read in the synagogues. They were not to be distributed. They were only for the
Chosen.
For the chosen.
Was that like a fear of misunderstanding it's written? Or what was it?
Partly.
Okay.
Partly it was because only the initiated could understand what it meant.
Okay.
It was not knowledge. It was not knowledge meant for the masses. And I'm essentially quoting, or paraphrasing. So there were all these, in other words, twice as much material as was given, as was made public. So, what is that material, and where is it? Does it still exist? And so those are really, important questions. And then there's the question is, how exactly were the scriptures altered?
Yeah.
How undoubtedly there were other manuscripts floating around, besides the ones that were officially reconstructed as the official version, the Masoretic text, that had the official authorization of the Council of Elders, or whatever it would be. In other words, the protocols of the elders of Zion. That's something else. Because there was, and still is actually, a council of elders that kind of oversees publications for, gives them the kind of their blessing. So, and then how much of that, for example, has filtered down into Christianity, like the Book of Enoch, for example. Enoch has some obviously Christian elements, but there's some elements of it that go way, way, way back, because you see it referred to even in the Old Testament, not to mention in the New Testament, where it's quoted. So,
Why is the Book of Enoch not canonized?
because it's weird. Same reason why the Book of Revelation almost didn't get into the canon.
Wow. And why it's not read liturgically.
And why, it's not read liturgically.
Does that go the same with the Proto-Evangelion and other books?
Yeah, actually Proto-Evangelion is not weird.
Yeah.
It's
Thinking that.
but it's not essential. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, it's foundational in the life of the church, but it's not as foundational as the New Testament scriptures.
Fair.
I mean, our entire understanding of who Mary is comes out of the Proto-Evangelion.
I feel like if it were part of the official canon, it would probably snuffed a lot of modern movements right in the bud.
It would have, yeah.
And then the Revelation,
Well, for example,
fear mongering.
I mean, Islam has a much greater veneration for the Mother of God than Protestant Christianity. There's a whole book in the Quran of Mary. And she's highly, highly respected and venerated. And in Syria, The Muslims even go and venerate her icons
Wow.
and go to them for miracles and for,
Same in Turkey.
and yeah.
Shiites.
Mm-hmm. So, anyway. Well, it's probably time to wrap up. So, lots of things to think about. Now, if what I would suggest that for next week you start bringing a Bible and make sure it's got an Old Testament.
Yeah.
Orthodox Study Bible is probably got the most accessible Orthodox Old Testament. Bringing a Masoretic text is problematic because Masoretic text is really not suitable for Christians to use. So it's missing too much. And what we'll do is wrap up some of this discussion and then go into the visions of God in the prophets. So I would encourage you to look at Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel.
Any particular part of Isaiah, because that'd take me all week just to
Well,
do
Isaiah
by itself.
Isaiah is very complex. Isaiah is probably the most important of the prophetic books for Christians, by far. It's the most quoted. Isaiah chapter 6, in particular. Ezekiel chapter 1, and then 40 through 47. Daniel chapter 7. It's the vision of the Ancient of Days. So,
You said Isaiah 40 to 47,
yeah.
and Daniel 7.
Mm-hmm. Then another thing to look at is 2 Chronicles chapter 5, the consecration of the temple by Solomon, of the first temple. And one of the things that would be really interesting to do, but would take a lot of work, is to go through and compare the ritual as it's laid out in Exodus as compared to Deuteronomy, as compared to Ezekiel, and the Josianic reforms is very different.
You said 2 Chronicles, which...
5. And they're very important differences because it shows the radical change that happened liturgically in Judaism regarding the Passover and regarding the Day of Atonement. Tabernacles remains the same. I think people just like to have the booths, the huts. They lived in the huts. And so that became probably an adventure that kids would remember their whole lives.
Isn't that Transfiguration? Bruce?
Oh, yeah.
Bruce.
So, but the Feast of the Transfiguration used to be liturgically celebrated in late Lent. Probably, my guess is the Sunday before Palm Sunday. because all of the current commemorations are late. You know, one Sunday was the prodigal son, the next Sunday was the publican and the Pharisee, then there was still, the third Sunday was Sunday of the Cross. I don't know what the fourth Sunday was.
Triumph of Orthodoxy?
No, that's late. That's late. And then I think the fifth Sunday was probably the Transfiguration, and then Palm Sunday. So, and you've still got, and there's still evidence for some of that in the texts. Oh, it would have been the Lazarus and the rich man. So, okay. It is truly me to bless thee, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages.
Amen.
Hispola et in vespera.